Next we have Dr. Zoe Fortune from the Mekong Club. She is the research director at the Mekong Club, and she is going to show how organisations can use data again, but this case audit data, and once again looking at risk in supply chains. So as we've already heard, complex supply chains hide many of the risks of slavery that businesses are facing. So without further ado, let me welcome Dr. Zoe Fortune to the stage to share the tools.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm never quite sure if it's a good idea or not to follow the coffee break, but hopefully you're all sufficiently energized. So we've had a lot about data already, and we've heard about partnerships, and today's focus is really about partnerships and using data. So I really wanted to touch on three areas that we've mentioned earlier: about collaboration, about uniform tools and techniques, and about consistent data consolidation and use. So we've got things like we've got alliances, we've got counter-trafficking data collaboratives, we've got directories of organizations. We also have victim identification apps, we have artificial intelligence, we've got mobile phone technology, we've got GPS. So where do we go with the data from here? And what is it that's lacking? And what do we need? So here's my roadmap. It's nice and simple. What about the private sector? Okay. How can we use the data that the private sector has already got? And what about risk? How do we get better at identifying the risk of forced labor in our supply chains? And what data have we got that we can already use? We heard earlier about the high risk in supply chains. So what can we do about it? I want to touch on an analogy that I heard, and it's about HIV and AIDS. When we originally started thinking about how we could look at cocktails for drugs and AIDS, they discovered that the virus developed a resistance to each individual drug that they put on the market. So a doctor came along and suggested, how about combining those cocktails together? And thus the AIDS cocktail was introduced, and that was much, much more effective. So what about combining data together in a way from the private sector? In one of our working groups, we discussed that we needed a way to enable better identification of risk. So our footwear and apparel group came up with the idea of using audit data to look at risk at regional level, by product being manufactured, and by factory tier. Now, you may already know that some tools exist, but they don't aggregate data in this kind of way. What we need is a platform for us to compare data and iron out some of the possible difficulties in data collection. So I just want to focus on the data on the audit industry for a second. So say we look at audit data. The Global Apparel, Footwear and Textile Initiative estimated that $2 billion is spent by the industry each year on audits, and that major retailers carry out up to 4,000 audits each year, and in China alone, $1 billion is spent annually on auditing. Now that's huge. It's big business, and there must be a vast amount of data there that we can use. It's helpful. We can see what's going on within a factory. We can identify issues. We can track change over time. We can ensure compliance with local and national frameworks and legal. And we can do comparison between areas and factories. That's great, right? Well, not so much. So there are issues with some of the audit data. No data is perfect. And this is a quote from the SEDEX CEO, Jonathan Chapman. In actual fact, when you look at the statistics, the World Bank recently calculated that parallel or duplicate audits in the Vietnamese garment industry had added $50 to the cost of each worker per year. Now, those costs are probably passed on to the worker within the supply chain. So how can we make audit data better? We also have a lack of transparency. Data is sometimes proprietary, and it's shared across platforms. Different questions are used by different audit frameworks, and we have audit fatigue. We have initiatives like those from the Sustainable Apparel Coalition to harmonize methodology, but that's harmonization going forward, and it's for one specific sector. What about data already collected? What about the way that we can use a third-party NGO to get around some of the difficulties of using proprietary, expensive data? What about aggregating all that data together to create our AIDS cocktail? So what we've done is we've created a risk assessment matrix, and it does exactly that. It's an aggregated source of data. So far, we have multiple sources of data, and we've looked at 15,000 lines of audit data from across multiple different question sets. Now, that's a great way that the private sector can aggregate data together. And it's a risk framework based on a data-driven process. So what we've done is we've used the ILO indicators of forced labour, but we've taken those indicators and looked through the data. And I'll show you what I mean in a moment. But this enables us to know what the risks are in a factory, to enable compliance for better due diligence and better investigation. Be able to ask better questions so you can better arm your auditors, not just with the data from the previous year, but with data from a whole host of other audits. And be able to use data from a resource not previously used in this way. So let me take you through what it looks like. So you can see on the screen, you've got a map of the world. So this is a mixture of some live data and some dummy data that we're still prototyping this. But so you've got drop-down menus at the top, and you've got the apparel and assembly. So let's say we want to look at the apparel industry, and we want to look at assembly, which is approximately tier 1. We have data from tier 1 and from tier 2. So this shows a map of the world where we have theoretical or actual live audit data. So we want to focus on China. So we click on China. Now what you can see is an aggregated risk score pulling from multiple sources of audit data to say what is my risk by region for a particular product and in a particular tier. So for this, you can see that for the assembly or tier 1 of apparel, Sichuan province in China is a little bit more risky. How risky? So that's when we dive a little bit deeper into the data, and then we can start to see the risk. We can also have links to other databases. So up here, you can start to say, well, this particular region, you can link to other databases, for example, NGO reports, media reports, etc. So you can say what's going on in this region. But then you can also see the average risk pulled from multiple sources of audit data for that particular region, for your particular product and your tier. That means if you're a company or a supplier, you can get better at knowing where to do your due diligence and to actually analyze your risk. But we wanted to go a step further than that. So you can see at the bottom there's a chart, and this is actually this is a mock-up. So this is not live data pulling on this chart. But we wanted to be able to say, okay, well, if we know what the average risk of forced labor is for this particular region, for this product, what is it that's causing that risk? So we've dug a little bit deeper. And we are now able to say, we can say what are the particular areas of risk for that particular region. So you can see that we've taken the ILO indicators, but for example, if you look at the ILO indicators, things like deception, they're quite difficult to measure and note in an audit. So what we've done is we've taken a data-driven approach, and we've analysed all those lines of audit data to say, what are the questions that are common across those audits, and what are the kind of themes that are actually being measured, and then we've grouped them into these categories. So for example, accommodation comes up, because that's something that we can notify within an audit. But that's also important for a risk of forced labour, because you might have, for example, someone who is sleeping in a dormitory with their supervisor, or there might not be any doors on the toilet, and that's an issue. These kind of things are risks. So we're not saying that forced labour exists in this particular region for definite, yes or no. What we are saying is there's a way to go and do better due diligence, use this data to actually look at that risk. So we can start to say the number of times an issue has been identified. And then what we can also do is you can show that on a comparison. So you probably can't see this very clearly, but what you can start to do is you can start to compare your risk within your region, within your product and your tier, and then you can plot that. So you can start to say, well, what is my risk if I want to source accessories or footwear in tier 1 in Vietnam, in this example, or if I want to source footwear from these particular regions in China at tier 1 or tier 2, what's the risk that we know so far? And this is using live audit data that we've aggregated together to enable us a way to get better identification of this. And then what we can also do is we can start to download reports from that. So we've started with apparel and footwear, and there are innovations in this field, and I would say that apparel and footwear is perhaps one of the leaders in this sector, but it can be used for anything, and we actually already have data from electronics industry, from jewellery, you can also do it with construction, anything there is systematic collection of data. And we are only piloting, but I think this shows the power of what can actually be done. We can also add in other different sources of data. For example, worker voice data. We can add in information that you might find on poverty index or anything else. And then you can start to build up a huge database where you can start to correlate this information. That's the power of what we can do, and that's the power of what the private sector can do if we pull together and aggregate our data in this way. And so far we have data that companies have donated to us or allowed us to use in this way that we can bring together as a third party. So just to go back to my HIV analogy, in 2018 there were an estimated 36.7 million people living with HIV and AIDS. And actually 35 million people, since the start of the epidemic, have died. But look at the improvements that have been made since that time. And now you compare those figures to modern slavery. So I say, let's get better aggregating data, and then maybe we can find our data cocktail. Thank you.